Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Negotiations, ceasefire, peace deal. We all have been hearing these terms thrown around all the time in the last couple of weeks. And now it seems that there is some kind of expectation that there is a imminent agreement coming on the table as Donald Trump and Trump's administration is extorting pressure on Ukraine. And everyone is afraid that Ukraine is just going to cave in. Now, constant viewers of this channel already know what I'm going to say, but for the people that don't, I want to remind that Ukraine is a country that has found its agency. President Zelensky came forward and reminded about this himself. So let's dive in what's right now on the table, what is being discussed, and why it is Ukraine that's going to ultimately decide what is going to happen next. President Zelensky came out to the public with his statements, so let's listen to the short clip.
I agree with President Trump that right now Ukraine does not have enough weapons to take back control of the Crimean Peninsula by force, but we have the ability to use sanctions. The world has the levers for other types of pressure, economic pressure, diplomatic pressure. Discussion of territorial issues should start only after a full and unconditional ceasefire. That is our vision. And to the proposals of the United States, we are once again grateful for the proposals from all our partners, from the United States and Europeans, from everyone. We respond that a complete unconditional ceasefire opens up the possibilities to talk about everything.
And we are ready for dialogue in any format, with anyone, anytime, but only after a real signal that Russia is ready to end the war. Such a signal is a complete unconditional ceasefire.
As you can hear, and what I have been explaining many times, is that Ukrainians understand very well what an end to the war should look like. They want to have long-term prosperity for Ukraine. They want to see the country that will receive investments after the war is over. For Ukrainians, ceasing of hostilities does not mean just giving away everything to Russia, doesn't mean just stopping of killing. For them, it's transitioning from the hot phase of fighting Russia on return of their territories, transitioning to the diplomatic sphere of fighting Russia, applying more pressure on Russia. It doesn't mean that there's going to be forgiveness for Russia, and it does not mean validation of Russian genocidal efforts of extermination of Ukraine. No, they will not surrender. They just want to stop the killing but keep the fighting with Russians with other means. And in the last couple of days, I've been overly critical to the European leaders seemingly disappearing from a lot of the diplomatic stage with regards to the talks with Ukraine. However, after the meeting in London, we now get some details, and I think I finally can relax a little bit with my criticism towards the Europeans here. Because it seems that Europeans, instead of trying to get their own representative in talks with Ukraine, they are more than not support the Ukrainian position wholeheartedly. So after the talks of London, the one that failed, but still there was a meeting of certain representatives, certain principles were agreed upon by all parties. As I already mentioned, Europeans are fully supporting of Ukraine. But other than that, firstly, they emphasize that a peace agreement should be based on the international law and not surrender. Additionally, the document emphasized the importance of security guarantees for Ukraine as a prerequisite for peace. And the third point stated that Ukraine should be at the center of negotiations, not Donald Trump and the USA. The fourth point emphasized the importance of Crimea and that Russia must not take control of it because it will be a threat to NATO and the United States and also Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria. In the fifth point, they talked about that Russia should not dictate anything about the size or the capabilities of Ukrainian armed force or its industrial base. And these principles showed themselves in the counteroffer that Ukrainians and Europeans put on the table before Russians and Americans. And it's still maddening for me that I need to put USA and Russia in the same bucket, but this is where we are at, I guess. And this counteroffer, I really like how the channel To Be Or did it, because not only it outlined what the counteroffer is, it also struck out the things that were initially proposed by Russians. I don't want to say Americans because it's clearly Russian demands, and the things that Ukraine will not agree, and what Ukraine and Europeans will be striving forward. So no negotiations are not even close to any kind of conclusion, but as you will see in a second. First point, ceasefire. Ukrainians and Europeans stating full and unconditional commitment to a permanent ceasefire in the skies, on land, and at the sea. Second point, both sides immediately begin technical implementation of negotiations with participation of the United States and European countries. In parallel, the agenda and modalities of a complete peace deal are being prepared. Third, monitoring the ceasefire led by the United States and supported by third countries. Fourth, Russia must unconditionally return all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children. Exchange of prisoners of war on the principle of all for all. Russia must release all civilian prisoners. Next, the point on security guarantees for Ukraine. Again, very, very important thing. Ukraine receives reliable security guarantees, including Article 5-like ones from the United States, as long as there is no consensus among the allies on Ukraine's accession to NATO. No restrictions for the Ukrainian Defense Force. The guarantors will be European states, plus those outside Europe who wish. No restrictions on the presence, armaments, or operations of friendly foreign armed forces on Ukrainian territory. It has been struck out that Ukraine will not try to join NATO. Ukraine will have the full capabilities to join any alliance or grouping of countries that they want. The territorial discussion. The United States, the Euro recognizes Crimea as Russian position, struck out. The United States de facto recognizes Russian control of the Luhansk region, struck out. The United States de facto recognizes Russian control over parts of the Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Kherson region, struck out. And instead, all territorial issues will be discussed and resolved after a complete and unconditional ceasefire. Negotiations on territories begin on the basis of the current line of contact. Ukraine is returning the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant with American participation. The control will not be transferred to the United States and then working with both sides. That is not up for negotiations. Ukraine regains control over the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station. Ukraine receives unlimited passage along the Dnieper River and also control of the Kirnbun split, which allows the entrance to the Black Sea from the city of Mykolaiv. Economy. The United States and Ukraine are implementing the economic cooperation envisaged in the resource deal. Ukraine will be completely reconstructed. Ukraine will receive full financial compensation, including frozen Russian assets, which will remain frozen until Russia compensates Ukraine for the damage. Sanctions imposed on Russia in 2014 will not be fully lifted and may be gradually eased once a sustainable peace is achieved, but will be reintroduced if the peace agreement is violated. Struck out is the United States and Russia will cooperate in energy and other production sectors. That is, should not be part of this deal. And here it's important to understand why things that supposedly only the United States would be doing, such as recognition of Crimea by the United States, or the control of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant by the United States and selling both to Ukraine and to Russia, or the fact that US will be cooperating with Russia on energy and resources. It should not be part of this deal, because if there is any deal with Putin, under this deal will be a signature of Zelensky. So if Zelensky signs off that US recognizes Crimea, that's pretty much like a sign off of Zelensky recognizing that Crimea is not part of Ukraine. It's just it's a weird, ambiguous way of delivering that shitty proposal by proxy. So as you can see, Ukraine will not be just bullied into signing something they don't want. Ukrainians have the agency of driving this war to the conclusion that they can accept, and they will not agree to anything less. And Trump's administration need to understand this. They need to understand that Ukrainians are not country with no cards that is run by a semi-dictator or whatever else comes into the Trump's tweets tomorrow. It doesn't matter what Trump says. He has very little pressure on Ukraine that he can extort. The help from the United States is important, but Ukrainians are thinking more than just immediate ceasefire. They're thinking on how they can preserve and make sure their country prospers long term and not get invaded again by Russia. They are looking to protect their future generations from the horrors of their existing war. If this war goes away, it must never return. But while the war is still ongoing, Ukraine has delivered a very strong message to the Russians. In the Moscow region, General Moscalik has been blown up by the Ukrainian saboteurs. He could be counted as a top 30 general in the Russian military. He is one of the leaders in designing the operations against Ukrainians on the front line. So it's an additional blow, explosive blow to the Russian military. He's not super leading general, but it's still gonna help Ukrainians a lot. And more importantly, what I do think Ukrainians will be glad for is that around the same time, a second explosion under the car has taken out a lead designer of the Russian electronic warfare systems. The one that designed some of the bigger stationary systems has now gone away to their ancestors. In basically one day, Russians took out a couple of very important characters, and it was done with the work of the either saboteurs or some kind of resistance forces inside Russia. And this delivers a very simple but very clear message. If you are a war criminal, if you are working for the Russian war machine, the retribution will come. At some point, somewhere, sometime, there will be a retribution for what you're doing right now. Ukrainians will not forgive killing of their civilians, children, and all of the other horrific war crimes that you, Russians, are doing. It might take some time, but the payback will definitely come. And these guys already felt it. Now, who's going to be next? Then let's quickly zoom in into potentially another sabotage that happened just recently, and that is what happened to that big storage base near Moscow, one of the biggest Russian artillery depots that they used to store air defense for Moscow. They stored ammunition to make sure that Moscow is protected. Basically, one of the most important facilities if any threat to the Russian capital will ever happen. And well, it was bad. It's basically halved after that explosion. So the data shows that over 38% of the buildings got blown up to smithereens. They are gone. Additional 18% or so have been severely damaged, and only about 30 to 40% that are still remain untouched. So yes, in either Ukrainian saboteurs or some kind of localized sabotage groups or resistance fighters or whoever else, it's definitely, I mean, unless you believe the theory that Russians just did it by accident in the same way that they shut down their own planes by accident, that later turned out, no, it was Ukrainians that shut down the planes by accident. But whatever the case, about half of one of the biggest Russian storage facilities has now been blown up to smithereens. And in another bad message to Russia, on the 21st of April, we got notification that the Swedish early warning and control aircraft, essentially the Awax from Sweden that were promised to Ukraine, have arrived. So they are now in Ukraine, and Ukrainians are trying to adapt it to the Ukrainian needs. And very, very soon, it's going to be up in the air, helping Ukrainians fight any kind of air targets with their own early warning plane. Great news, and I'm happy that Ukraine is finally getting some advanced capabilities. I've also talked a little bit about the difficulties of the modern drone warfare, and that both for Russia and Ukraine, the new type of warfare is very, very challenging, and that we should be looking for some kind of breakthrough. But one thing is, like me, a no-name guy on YouTube talking about this, despite the fact that I'm getting it from the guys on the front line and whatever. Completely other thing is when about it writes and talks someone of the caliber of Valery Zaluzhny, the ex-commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, that pretty much made a breakthrough discovery of this, so to say, doctrine. And he talks about this. I'm going to leave a link to this article in the bottom, but some of the important things that he says, and I will read it to you, that gradually, as in World War I, this war entered a stupor later in 2024. The development of scientific and technological progress led to a situation where drones were no longer the only means of striking targets, not only in the front line, but also in operational depth. This made it impossible to find any equipment, firepower, or reserves beyond even the front line. So what he says basically is that drones became so capable and so persistent that getting any kind of reserves towards the front line and make some kind of activity close to the front line became really, really hard. Due to absolute transparency of the front line, 10 to 15 kilometer zone of continuous death was formed in front of the front line. It is no longer surprising when a drone hunts not for a group target or an armored object, but for even individual soldiers. By the way, this zone is constantly expanding, as is the probability of being destroyed, because drones are getting better to strike the targets and they're able to fly further. At the operational level, the war has reached a stalemate. Deep maneuvers or strikes to operational depth become impossible, largely because the confrontation between unmanned systems on one hand and electronic warfare and air defense means on the other. Therefore, classic offensive operations and offensive actions have not only lost their effectiveness, but have become almost suicidal. Over time, even offensive actions by small, highly mobile and technologically equipped tactical groups coordinated with situational awareness support, electronic warfare, and air defense systems became highly ineffective. Thus, we can say with confidence that 1. Thanks to unmanned systems and digital technologies, the traditional and familiar types of weapons that defined the nature of war for decades have become history. They are gone. Armored vehicles, which have been the basis of offensive operations since 1915, have become defenseless against cheap drones, and therefore their use in other types of combat is impossible today. High-precision weapons that use GPRS positioning have lost their effectiveness due to development of electronic warfare. Air defense is undergoing perhaps the biggest transformation. The emergence of a large number of small and cheap drones has made the use of extremely expensive missiles for air defense systems economically impractical. The airspace above the battlefield became inaccessible to manned aircraft and turned it into auxiliary means of air defense. Aviation needs modernization and the ability to conduct reconnaissance and strike from completely different distances. 6. The sea space has gradually been occupied by naval drones. Now powerful ships hide in protected ports. This is not just technology. All of this requires a complete rethinking of the forms and means of application. As a result, the military doctrine has revised. This will lead to a revision of the principles of organization of the armed forces and ultimately to defense planning. So what General Zaluzhny is basically stating here is that right now, with the modern capabilities, Ukraine and Russia are the only two countries that are able to conduct modern type of warfare. If ever there is a contact between Russia and some of the countries that we are in right now, like European states, then it will be basically like tanks meeting cavalry, knights meeting guns. It is going to be a technological suicide for us to go against the Russians. Russians will have a dominant advantage over everything that we have. Because if you look at the points that Zaluzhny made here, you can just easily describe pretty much any modern military in Europe and how they're operating and what their operations are based on. We are essentially in the past, whereas Russia and Ukraine are fastly moving forward. Now, they are in the depth of war. So when we're seeing footage, we're seeing that it doesn't look that impressive. You know, people sitting in dugouts and all dirty and so on. But what they're doing and the way that they're doing, that is basically the next level of warfare that is right now ongoing. And we are in Europe utterly unprepared, and we need to get better at this. And that is why it's crucial for us to support Ukraine further, to make sure that Ukrainians get all of the capabilities and buys us enough time so we get prepared for all of this. And also message here, as you can realize, is that this is very bad news for Russia. That right now, with the modern type of warfare, Russia has no answer on how to defeat Ukraine. Basically, what Zaluzhny has described is that defensive advantage is right now massive. So for Russia to take over Ukraine militarily is basically a non-starter. This is a huge combination for Ukraine to demand essentially better deal from both Russia and Trump. Because as much as Russia wants to pretend that they are winning, as much as Trump wants to claim that Russia is being kind to Ukraine by not capturing the territories of Ukraine, the truthful answer is Russia just can't. They are too damn weak to do so. And they're weak not because of the support from the allies of Russia, not because their production capabilities so shit. No, they are weak because Ukrainians are too strong. They learned, they adapted, they perfected the tactics. Ukrainians right now are the most capable military in Europe, and they're kicking Russians' ass. And to wrap it up, this is another excellent example of the modern Russian military. As you can see, all of the glory of their technical advantage has absolutely waned. They're putting fishing nets on top of their highly mobile advanced vehicles. And obviously, this is they're trying to adapt to the modern warfare that we talked about just now. But more importantly, it shows the state of Russia and how far they have fallen, that they need to use these adaptations instead of armored vehicles, instead of some kind of modern technologies or anything. But this is what is the driving right now, the warfare, and how Russia is still able to get some advantages. And obviously, a lot of dead Russians. They're walking over their own bodies, and I'm glad that Ukrainians are able to stay defensive and kick Russians' butt some more. And to help Ukrainians kick Russian butt some more, participate in a fundraiser. We're over the half, so let's do it. Let's get some trucks to the Ukrainian armed forces. Get yourself a patch. This is the time to do it. Trust in Ukrainian armed forces. Watch the video that I just did with Jonathan Fink at his Silicon Curtain channel. It's gonna be great. I love you. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.